There's a report from the Washington Post that Iran hired assassins to target critics of the regime living abroad, along with planning more attacks on Israeli, European, and American citizens. Now, to talk about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, joins us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, this literally sounds like something from a Hollywood movie script.
Yeah, and you know what? We know it's true because it's happened before, right? I know dissidents in Canada that have been targeted for speaking out against the Iran regime, whether they be activists or journalists. Also in the United States, we have a case, several cases, but one prominent one where a woman is now living in an FBI safe house because of the targets on her from directly from the Iran regime. There was a plot to kidnap her and take her to Venezuela, etc. It's a long story, but the point being, how pathetic are we here in the West, where a story comes out in the Washington Post describing our vulnerabilities against a tyrannical terrorist regime? Do we not have the enforcements in place? Because the experts that are quoted in the piece talk about how this is imminent. We know they will eventually get through on cases, and they have in the past as well. But we're talking about this time around, as the Iranians are entering the third month of protests. And a lot of dissidents across the world, particularly in Canada and the United States, where a lot of expats live, are being very vocal and speaking out and petitioning local and federal governments to do something about the Iran regime. So, of course, they have targets on all of us that are covering this, that are speaking out about this. And this report is very unfortunate. And again, Hal, we knew this to be true, but to see it in writing, to see it officially published in a very well recognized paper, it's something else. So of course, this is a wake up call to to law enforcement, local and more broadly, to keep an eye on dissidents, to keep an eye on threats, to take threats more seriously when they come through, to take hacking and other types of risks more seriously, because eventually this is what they want. They want access. They want to intimidate us. They want to silence us in order to not have these stories be told.
Lisa, there was also another report, this one from the Tasnim agency, that Iran executed four for allegedly spying for Israel.
Yeah. So during this round of protests and before, remember this, for the last 43 years, this regime came into power and called the United States the big Satan and Israel the small Satan, which it has more access to regionally. So anytime they wanted to arrest people on trumped up charges, we would hear often that they would be convicted for spying for Israel. And in this case, in the last 3 months, of course, we have a lot of focus on Iran because of the protests. These four individuals were arrested, and then these bogus charges of spying for Israel were slapped on them, and then they were allegedly executed over the weekend. So very, very unfortunate. Again, where is the UN? Where is the mainstream media? Where are, the powers that be, the European Parliament, the United States, Canada? They want to see more support from these countries.
TikTok accounts being run by the propaganda arm of the Chinese government have apparently accumulated millions of followers, and many of these videos have been very critical of the United States and its politicians.
Right, not just any politicians. These are all Republicans. So these are accounts that got many followers. And of course, who's surprised that the Chinese who own TikTok are now using TikTok to their own political benefits? It makes perfect sense. And these are why we were warned about TikTok and what it could potentially do by gaining this type of access and viewership around the world. So they use these accounts to gain followers, and then they put up videos about politicians like Greg Abbott of Texas, or Ted Cruz, or Marco Rubio, prominent Republicans who have a lot of influence in the base. And of course, they're using these platforms to put all kinds of messages to young people. You have to look at the results here, right? What kind of damage is this doing to the psyche of young voters? And it's not just about politics. I'm sure it's about other very, very dangerous subjects as well. So this is where the influence is at. This is what parents know their children are watching. And again, not just about politics, about many other topics that should have more viewer and parental discretion.
When Trump was president, wasn't there a push to eliminate or even kind of limit the influence of TikTok in the United States?
Yes, which upset a lot of young people more because they rely on TikTok, whether it's a monetization of their platform or because they just are addicted to it, just like many other social media platforms. But it's a time sucker. People stay on there for hours. They love it. They rely on it. And President Trump said there's much more to this. It's a dangerous platform. It's owned by the Chinese. We won't know and we won't have access to our own information. We won't know what they're doing with that information and that access. And here we go. This is a very, I should say, small and benign example of what they can be capable of doing with that platform and that kind of influence.
Now, Lisa, still with China, the former vice president of EcoHealth Alliance, Dr. Andrew Huff, says he worked very closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China and says he knows for a fact that COVID-19 was genetically engineered and then leaked.
Ding, ding, ding. I mean, it's shocking to see this allowed, right, and not be blocked as misinformation the way it was for the last 2.5 years on social media. No one's surprised, but I am surprised at one thing. When President Biden had a chance to sit down with the Chinese president just a couple of weeks ago, they had a 3.5 hour meeting when none of this was brought up. No questions about COVID, no questions about its origin, no questions about the Chinese crackdowns on its own people who are now on the streets protesting their government because of their COVID policies. None of that was brought up. The only thing we got as a takeaway with the White House notes was that there will not be an invasion of Taiwan by China, which we have no guarantee that's even a fact. But the more important thing here, Hal, is that for the last couple of years, I should say, so many people tried to get some real transparency on this, to question it, to come up with, why. And politicians in the United States blocked these questions because they didn't want this to be blamed on China, the Chinese government, or any narrative that would place the blame on anything but Donald Trump and the way that this was run. So whether it was Fauci or Biden or Pelosi or Schumer or any of them, all these influential figures tried to really suppress this question, really suppress this topic, and here you go. But what are we going to do about it? Now COVID is like the common cold. We have to accept it. So many lives were senselessly lost, and we all know people who died because of COVID. And again, no accountability here, no transparency. And of course, the story gets told in this way, buried in a small headline. And we're glad to bring it to you at the Foreign Desk. And Hal, I thank you for bringing it up as well.
Absolutely, Lisa. Okay, let's shift our focus now to what's happening in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is now in its 10th month. Lisa, Russia is still rejecting calls to pull out from Ukraine as a condition for peace talks. A Ukrainian official says his country's battle losses have added up to 13,000 troops so far, 13,000 and counting.
Senseless, completely senseless, right, Hal? And we don't know where the end will be, where the finish line is for Putin even. I mean, if he's not willing to look at, some sort of compromise or ceasefire or an end to all of this, if he's not willing to do that, then what is the finish line for him? When will he declare his own version of victory so that he can back off and end this war once and for all? And here we have maybe some sort of prospects for the international community to intervene and end this senseless war. But of course, Putin is not on board.
Lisa, closer to home, Border Patrol agents made a historic liquid fentanyl seizure in South Texas. And we're talking about enough fentanyl to kill over 5.5 million people?
It's horrific, right? Each day we hear about more and more fentanyl being seized at the border. This time, liquid fentanyl, Hal. That means easier to absorb and more easily spread, right? So what are they going to do with this? Put it in drinks like roofies or put it in different ways where young people will have access to it and die because they do not have any control of this substance or what it can do or how lethal it is. Another reason why the border is so dangerous right now. And as we talked about last week, reports about this also trickling into Canada. So the risk is for all of us in the Northern Hemisphere to truly keep an eye on the borders. There's no way to vet what's coming in, how quickly people are coming in, the sheer number of people coming in, and of course, the substances that they're able to bring in with them. So, buyer beware. This is, how many stories like this do we need, or how many stories do we need of innocent suburban teens and preteens just experimenting with drugs for the first time and dying of overdose because of fentanyl. So again, I mean, I don't know what it's going to take. The Border Patrol agents are complaining. Everyone is complaining, but there's no true leadership from the top down to put an end to this.
Now, the Biden administration says it may revive Trump-era border policies. Biden says he wants to make it more difficult to seek asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. Tell me more about that.
Well, it'll be too late to have them not seek asylum at the border. The point is not to have this lax policy in order for them to get up and get going, right? So they're not from Mexico, and that's what a lot of people don't understand is they're coming from countries that are further south, so Honduras, Guatemala, and others, El Salvador. So by the time they get to Mexico, they've already made up their mind and packed up their lives. So there's something that needs to be done, whether they remain in Mexico, which has not been as much of an option because Mexico is trying to worry about its absorption of migrants and then trying to get into the United States, where if we're not providing them with the asylum, well, they'll do other things to get in illegally. So there has to be more that's done in terms of a posture, in terms of a stance that tells these migrants that it's not going to happen the way that they believed it was going to happen for the last 2.5 years. So more has to be done. And of course, reverting to the Trump era policies means taking a stance like Donald Trump that is more firm against, in defending our borders. He talked about a wall for a reason, not because he's a horrific, horrible human being who doesn't want to let people into the United States, but it's because he wanted to keep the borders safe. And now, of course, many of the states on the border, including Arizona and Texas, are talking about completing the portions of the border wall themselves because of this crisis. Again, in theory, a lot of these policies seem humane, but in practice, they are inhumane. When you see people getting raped at the border, when you see the drugs that are coming in, when you see people drowning because of the risks that they have to take to get over, it's not a humane policy whatsoever. So perhaps all of these things will give a signal to the Biden administration to have a much more stringent stance on immigration and on the border so that they won't have these issues going forward.
Now, Lisa, speaking of migrants, there are reports that 273,000 Americans allegedly moved to Canada in 2022. What are your thoughts on that? Over 250,000 people.
Right. Well, they came a little late, right? I thought those would be the ones who swore they would move to Canada after Trump was elected, but perhaps they postponed their move. But it doesn't surprise me. We're seeing a lot of people looking around at the realities of life. We're seeing a lot of moves to red states like Florida, like Texas, Nevada, Arizona, and well, those states are kind of leaning blue at this point. But of course, those are states that are traditionally red and have policies that are red, and no state income tax, and so on. So it doesn't surprise me that people want to pick up and start new. And Canada, of course, being a new country, of course, new opportunities, and people move all over the place. So it's not surprising that we're seeing these kinds of numbers.
So, Lisa, when are you moving north? Remember, the mountains are calling your name.
Yeah, I love Canada. I would love to live there.
U.S. correspondent and foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari, and she's one of our regulars. Thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure.